Hello, I'm Christopher Smith, the Executive Chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to these events surrounding the scoping study funded by AHRC and Research Libraries UK on the role of academic and research libraries as active participants and leaders in the production of scholarly research. The Arts and Humanities Research Council is one of the constituent councils of UKRI, and our remit has a particular relevance to the study which takes place in libraries, but also the studies of libraries themselves. And we are particularly interested in shaping the future funding landscape and strengthening the role of research libraries to create opportunities for their resources and expertise to benefit future research programs. We're really excited to be working with Evidence Base to produce a really detailed, international, comprehensive study of the way that people have engaged with libraries and the way that librarians have engaged with our research funding landscape. And we hope that this consultation will create findings and recommendations for universities, researchers, libraries, and their funders. We're really keen on cross-sector collaboration. We're absolutely committed to recognise the contribution of libraries, archives and museum staff to internationally significant research across the arts and humanities. And we're very pleased to, as part of UKRI, the UKRI has signed the Technicians Commitment, which is all about seeking to support research professionals as fully equal partners in the research ecosystem and the research process. There's no question about the role that libraries have played, no question the role that they've played for centuries, no question the role that they've played in the current research landscape, no question how unbelievably important their role has been through the COVID pandemic, in keeping research going as much as possible. And I want to thank everybody for their efforts in that regard, but also no question that libraries are an absolutely central part of the post-COVID future. So I'll close by saying that we know that we work much better and achieve much more when we work in partnership. We know those partnerships need to be equitable, and I'm really excited to be working with RL UK on this consultation, to finding out the results and then to putting them into practice. This all depends on your active participation, and for those of you who are participating in these meetings, town halls, answering questionnaires, answering interviews, that's great, but please encourage others to participate as well so we get a broad an understanding of this really vital subject for the future of our research landscape. Thank you very much.
Welcome everybody. As David was saying, I'm Tao Chang. I'm Head of Infrastructure at AHRC. And in this particular panel, I suppose it could be said that I represent the money. I'll be very brief in terms of a little bit of context for this particular event today. Context for why AHRC is commissioning this research now. The short answer is we would like you and others within your community to help us, to tell us and help us spend our money. But sort of slightly more seriously and less flippantly, there are a few policy drivers as well. The first is that in February last year, UKRI became the first major national funder to sign the Technician Commitment, which commits us as an organisation, including AHRC, to recognising the role of highly skilled experts and individuals who may not hold standard academic contracts and their role to research and innovation. The second policy driver is that you may have seen that in late 2019, UKRI published two reports on research and innovation infrastructure. One of them, entitled Opportunities to Grow Our Capability, identified a need to invest in arts and humanities research infrastructures, or in infrastructures, knowledge infrastructures, which enabled excellent research. And libraries, research libraries, as well as the skills and expertise that library professionals bring to the table, was seen to be a key part of this. Why we think it's important? We think it is becoming increasingly important to recognize that there is a role for highly skilled professionals who may not hold standard academic contracts, but who are extremely knowledgeable, and their voice in shaping research proposals and major research projects needs to be properly recognized, acknowledged, and heard. What we hope for from this research is that we will have a much clearer sense of how we can direct future funding. For example, would you like specialized calls which bring more library and research and academic library professionals on board and recognize their contribution to research? What sort of interventions would you like to see from AHRC to make this happen? So I think I'll stop there because I've said enough.
You're on mute, David.
My apologies. Sorry. I'll say that again. Many thanks, Tao. I'm glad that you're able to stay with us for the panel discussion later on. I'm now going to ask Matt to say a few words from the RL UK point of view.
Thanks very much, David. And first of all, can I add my welcome to Tao and David? It's fantastic to see so many of you on the call today, and thank you for joining us. As a number of you might be aware, but maybe not all of you, Research Libraries UK is a consortium of 37 of the UK and Ireland's largest research libraries. We are here to convene our members around some of the key issues and challenges and opportunities that they face as organisations. We're here to represent them, to provide a collective voice, and also to advocate on their behalf. Although we are a membership organisation, we place a really high premium on partnership, and wherever possible work with colleagues right across the information, library, heritage and cultural sectors. And that's why we're so delighted that we've been able to commission this research, to work in partnership with the AHRC and with Evidence Base, and also to have this opportunity to meet with you all today. For RUK, this research is really about establishing three things. Firstly, it's about understanding the potential of academic libraries, archives, museums, and galleries to cement their current role as partners in and leaders of academic and scholarly research. We know that many libraries, archives, and museums are already working in partnership with academics and scholars. We know that these partnerships and collaborations are becoming increasingly complex and varied as the collection and what might be done with it diversifies and the range of skills and experience held within our institutions grow. The number and complexity of research collaborations involving libraries, archives, and museums reflect this ongoing shift, or an ongoing shift, from their role as service providers to one of research partnership and leadership. This transition from service provider to active research partner to research leader for libraries, archives, and museums is not without some of its challenges. So secondly, we would like this research to establish the nature and extent of any barriers that prevent or limit the role of academic libraries, archives, or museums as research partners and leaders. These barriers could be internal within the institution. It could be around perceptions of the library, archive, or museum, or maybe the terms and conditions of funding. So we really want this research to try and establish what some of these barriers might be and what their impact is. Thirdly, finally, and arguably most importantly, we'd like this research to see how some of these barriers can be overcome. So what are the possibilities for academic libraries, archives, and museums to further enhance, grow, and cement their role as partners and research leaders? And how can they be recognized as such? In terms of what we want from this research, we want this research and the report that results from it to be interesting. Of course we do, but most importantly, we want this research to be useful. We want it to clearly identify tangible ways in which we might increase and enhance the variety of research partnerships that libraries, archives and museums are involved in, how the challenges and barriers preventing them from doing so can be overcome, and how AHRC as a consortium, working with our members and non-members, and I stress this, put particular stress on us working beyond our membership, working with stakeholders and colleagues at the AHRC and elsewhere, how can we work together to increase this role and enhance this role of libraries as research partners and leaders? So that's why we're so pleased that you've joined us here today. And as with all great collaborations, we hope today we'll start with a conversation between institutions, between professions, career stages and disciplines. So thank you all for joining us.
A few words about myself and Jane. We're two members of the team that's been appointed to undertake the scoping study. So I'm Professor David Baker. I'm a former Vice Chancellor, and before that I was a university librarian. I've also worked over many years with JISC on a number of projects. Most recently I've worked as a consultant in higher education, and I'm currently working with Evidence Base, who are based at Birmingham City University.
And hello everyone, my name's Jane Winters and I'm Professor of Digital Humanities and Pro-Dean for Libraries at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And my role in the project is to be an advisor and particularly working to connect out to the academic research community.
Thank you, Jane. We began work at the end of January. It's a very tight timescale. And the scoping study aims to understand what roles academics and research libraries are currently playing, particularly as Matt and Tao both said, in terms of as partners and as leaders in the research process. And it's about also understanding what further roles academic and research libraries could play in the scholarly research process, and to understand the nature and extent of any barriers and challenges that exist to exploiting the significant potential for academic and research libraries and librarians in the future. Obviously, the key element of the research is to make recommendations, again, as Matt said, what steps particularly need to be taken to address the issues and the challenges identified, and by whom. So the study runs up in the first instance to April, the main data gathering phase, and we're well underway. The survey is already available, and I will talk about how you access that and input into that at the end of the webinar. And we're also beginning to interview people. We have a target of between 75 and 85 people, including international colleagues, and we've got either arranged or actually carried out 25 interviews so far. We've got today, and then we've got the same event on the 3rd of March at 11 o'clock. So if you know of any colleagues who haven't been able to attend today and haven't signed up for the 3rd of March, then please do encourage people. We also have an open session, in other words, not behind a paywall, a 90-minute session at the AHRC UK conference on the 17th of March in the afternoon, and that will take a broader look at the study and give some progress report in terms of interim results. The second half of the project is about the analysis, the report and recommendations. There is going to be ongoing communication about developments that arise from the project. I'll be writing a blog after the second town hall, for example. There will be an opportunity for libraries that are not part of AHRC UK to be involved in the work, and our target date for completion is the end of June. So quite a lot of what I'm going to say has already been in some way covered, but there are 6 key points to the vision. The word partnership has come through quite a lot, about working in partnership, and about the vision of libraries, AHRC UK libraries and beyond, providing quality support through working in partnership. And that's one of the key areas of the scoping study, about investigating the role of library staff as partners and leaders in the initiation, production and dissemination of academic and scholarly research.
And they're moving on to thinking about increasing collaborative opportunities for researchers. I have a very personal interest in this. My work involves doing a lot of research using web and born digital archives, and the expertise for dealing with those archives largely lies in libraries. And the most successful research projects that I've ever been involved with have had libraries as a key partner, and I've learned a huge amount that I wouldn't otherwise have had access to from that knowledge and expertise. And I think we want to hear from you all about the ways in which we can start to break down some of the barriers that stop people developing those kinds of collaborations. I think researchers in humanities departments and researchers in libraries and wherever they're found, we don't always encounter each other easily. We don't go to the same departmental meetings. Even online, we tend not to go to the same conferences. And as has already been mentioned, there are lots of institutional and cultural barriers to making those connections. My first and most successful web archive collaboration just came out of a serendipitous cup of coffee at a conference held in a library. And I know serendipitous cups of coffee are more difficult these days, but how can we help to replicate some of those contacts? And academic and research libraries and librarians can bring expertise in such a wide range of areas. This is far from being an exhaustive list. There's collections expertise, digitisation, copyright and IP, public engagement, metadata and cataloguing, information architecture, open knowledge, data preservation, sustainable infrastructure. I could have gone on for a lot longer, but I will stop there. And there is so much knowledge to be exchanged. And I think it's really important for researchers based in humanities departments, for example, to remember that libraries have their own research agendas. So it isn't a case of researchers arriving with a project and expecting the library to provide a service, as was mentioned earlier, but there are complementary research agendas there and genuine opportunities to co-design research projects that will be better than the sum of their parts with those different stakeholders involved.
And one of the key challenges, of course, is to respond to future skills and resource needs. It's self-evident that we are going through a period of considerable turbulence and change, and already many libraries are moving from being service providers to taking more of an active role as meaningful research partners in the production of scholarly research. And it's also very self-evident already that there are significant skills and resource needs, but there are also significant pockets, areas of expertise within libraries, especially in digital scholarship. I speak of my own research and my own activity over a number of years involved in JISC initiatives, for example, going right back to the e-libraries program. And in that context, what will the future requirements be for academics, for librarians, in the broadest possible sense of the word, especially as we move to life after COVID? And it's not just going to be about growing and utilizing library expertise within the library, as it were, but as Jane's already pointed out, in terms of broader partnerships across the whole of academia. So we are looking very much to tease out the question of skills and resource requirements, but especially how best, given the need to target resources, I'm sure after COVID, how to grow and utilize library expertise. So one of the things that was right at the start of this is how is all this going to be funded? How is all this going to be resourced? What are the new funding frameworks for work in this field? Now, clearly, this is obviously one of the big underpinning questions to which we hope we can gain some answers during the course of this research and in terms of our final report from Evidence Base. Jane?
And it was great to hear Tao at the beginning saying that she's encouraging us all to help her think about how she can spend the AHRC's money, which is something it's great to hear from a funder. And I think it's not just about research collaborations, but thinking also about shared infrastructure, because that is something where funding is being seriously considered, the infrastructure roadmap that emerged recently. And academic and research libraries are a critical part of the UK's research infrastructure. And I think one key to the sustainability problems that we encounter so often in research projects and digital research projects that don't have that underpinning and contact with research libraries. And that's particularly true for the arts and humanities disciplines and social sciences. So we need to think about how we can work together to ensure that that academic research, wherever it happens, and the infrastructure that underpins it are advanced simultaneously and sustainably, and how we can help UKRI and the AHRC assist us to do that.
Many thanks, Jane. Before we go on, we have a question or two. Matt, there was one about libraries outside academia. Is that something that you could quickly answer? And then we have another question from Daryl Green.
So could you tell me the question for the outside academia? I can't see that question.
Is the programme also looking at working with libraries outside academia who may have collections of high value for research, but for whose organisations academic research is not a priority? Hint, answer probably involves fairer funding. And
yep.
That was in the chat, and then one in the Q&A proper, as it were, from Daryl Green.
So I think, thank you, Alison. And
Matt, quick answer on the...
Good to see your name, Alison, and I hope you're well. Thank you for that. Well, the focus of this project, as suggested at the start and within the brief, is in relation to academic and research libraries, and the majority of those, as you would imagine, would belong to university structures. That isn't necessarily, though, to the exclusion of institutions outside of university and higher education structures. So this is the focus of the project, but that isn't necessarily to the exclusion of others. So if you feel that you've got a valuable experience, you've got an experience that you would like to share that you think would be useful as part of this research, please do make that contribution. So the focus is on academic and research libraries within a HE context, but not necessarily to the exclusion of others. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Matt. And the question from Daryl, perhaps if I could start off, and then if Jane or Matt, you have any comments. I think the answer is yes. Well, consideration is being given to these issues, and already it's emerged as an issue. In other words, the question of traditional time buyout and the question of culture or lack of culture, cultural background in terms of time buyout for the sector, for librarians in particular, and that's certainly something that's emerging. So we will be giving consideration to that, definitely. Matt or Jane, anything you want to add before we move on?
Yes, I just wanted to add into that point of how easy it is to have librarians, curators, archivists acting as co-investigators. And I think there can be a lot of institutional challenges that research grant officers sometimes are very cautious about what equivalent professional expertise looks like. And I think that's something, if Tao were here, she would say that's absolutely not the AHRC's viewpoint. So I think sometimes those barriers to equivalent research status, along with buyout questions, are part of institutional attitudes to particular kinds of contracts, as was mentioned at the start. So that's definitely something that's come up a lot and will feed into the project.
And I think some of that will be touched on in the Mentimeter as well.
Indeed. And I think just a footnote to what you said, Jane, yes, the very early days, but certainly variation between institutions there as to approaches. Somebody said that they can't see any content in the Q&A, or it's just appearing, and I'm not sure whether there is a question of time lag, but it's something that we should be aware of as we go forward, panel members.
The Q&A is only visible to the panel, so if we read out questions.
Okay, yes, of course, yes, sorry, I'm getting mixed up between the chat and the Q&A. My apologies. Could I propose that we move on? We've got the first Mentimeter surveys. So we've had some answers already to this question. And if you'd like to participate, we first of all want to find out more about our audience. And so if you could first of all say who you are. You've got the categories there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got more librarians than academics at the moment, just. We've got some others. If you wish to say, if you're an other, if you wish to say what kind of other you are, you have the opportunity to say, as somebody's just commented in the chat. So any comments from my fellow panelists about the distribution? I think it seems very good distribution. It's certainly good to have got some university leaders and funder representatives. These categories are all categories of people we wish to engage further with, especially groups like the funders. I take the point about alarming a few archivists. Yes, again, when we say library, we do mean it in the very broadest sense. So we did split out other categories: archivist, records professional, curator or heritage professional, and so on and so forth. Any comments, Jane or Matt, before we move on to question 2?
It just strikes me that this is the kind, there aren't very many venues where you can get this mix of people, all of the people who are interested in these conversations. So that's something for us all to think about.
Good points.
I would agree. I think that distribution, I think it's fantastic once again to have the variety of people on this call today and to have your views and opinions, because it is a very rich mix, taking the note around archivists.
I know Paige Morgan doesn't want to disrupt the planned agenda, but it's a very interesting question about consideration to the different types of workloads in librarian versus faculty instructor roles. One of the challenges about expectation for professorial roles and so on and so forth, and the question of librarians' job descriptions. I think that's a very good point. Matt, do you want to say anything?
Just, we've noted the point around job descriptions, and I think that is a very interesting point. It's something that we've been very interested in within RUK. We've done surveys of job descriptions to see how the various competencies and the stress and the emphasis that I've placed upon these. So I think that is definitely something that we'd like to explore within this, and that may be one of those areas where actually some of our members might respond to some of the recommendations and findings. So yeah, very pertinent point.
Right, and we've got another comment about the other box. I'm going to leave that one aside for now, but just note the question about other. Could we move on to question 2, please? What career stage would you describe yourself as being at? I think if anybody hasn't answered, give you a few seconds to answer that question. We seem to have got quite a lot of answers in already. And it's very good that we've got so many established 20 years plus people, as well as the mid careers going up, and people in every category. I guess that's what you might call an expected distribution. Is that fair, Jane?
I think it
is that what you'd expect to see?
I think it probably is. I think it would be great to get more early career researchers. But I think that's sometimes harder to contact, but that's something again that we can really make sure, and early career people working in the library sector too.
Right, yeah. I think obviously, again, as I said earlier, if people have any colleagues that who aren't signed up to the next webinar, please do encourage people to join. We do want to get as rich a picture as possible, though I suspect we're already doing very well in that regard. If no more comments from you, Jane or Matt, question 3, have you been involved in any collaborative research projects with the library as a lead or named partner? It's not far off 50-50. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Obviously, we can capture these. Have you been involved in any unsuccessful research bids with the library as a lead or named partner, e.g. PI or co-investigator? Somewhat different distribution there, and the no's are going up. Any comments there? Tao, welcome back. Matt or Jane or Tao for that matter, anything you want to say?
David, not so much on those results, although it's connected to it, but there are some really interesting things coming up in the chat about the early career researcher question. And how do PhD students find out about postdoctoral funding to support those projects? The question of precarity and why it's really important for skills development and so on. So, so I think that is a really important strand for us to consider.
Absolutely, and I particularly would agree in terms of the point about direction on how to find postdoctoral funding. Yeah, all very good points. Okay, let's move on to question 5. Do you have plans to develop a collaborative research bid with the library as a lead or named partner? Yes, but an early stage. I guess if you add the first 3 bars together, you've got a vast majority who may not have firm plans, but could well be planning in the future, and only a very few who are definitely not planning to. Again, any comments there from our panel?
I'd be really interested to hear from the people in chat who are definitely not planning to, whether that is a specific reason to you or your institution, or simply that this isn't on your radar. So if you'd be willing, those people who did put those 5 responses, to put that in chat, or send it to the panel privately if you prefer. I'd be really interested to hear your perspectives.
Yes, I agree with that. I also I'm going to come back to the point about answering if you're a librarian, but I think there's also the point perhaps that we need to take on board, panel, about mention of archives and museums in the publicity, but mostly the talk is about libraries. I do think that's an important point in terms of range of engagement. So I think that's perhaps something that we need to take further on the chat. Any other comments on the chat? Librarians and academics. Obviously, we'll take all this on board in terms of the more detailed survey. Can we move on to question 6, unless panel members wish to say any more? And again, we've got a Wordle there. If we, I'm going to give. We don't have as many. Yes, it's going up now. We need a few more responses. I'll give sort of 5-10 seconds for people to just answer that. Any more? Yeah, we're going up a bit more. It'd be nice to get it up to 100, but not crucial. Colleagues, obviously the largest one is expertise, resources, specialist knowledge, collaborative. Any comment about those?
I really like the different perspectives one, actually, because I think that's what really helps with big interdisciplinary cross-sectoral projects. It's as being made to think about some of the things that you take for granted when you have different perspectives, and I think you end up with much better research projects and are challenged in a good way. So it's great to see that coming through.
Yeah.
I think that combination between expertise and knowledge and skills, and I think that we're going back to that point you made earlier, David, around digital scholarship, digital humanities, how some of the skills and technical skills contained within libraries are all really significant. So the combination of those things is interesting.
Obviously, we'll baseline that. Anything further? Tara, do you want to say anything? Any reaction from the AHRC?
Specifically from on question 6. I mean, I have to sort of lay my cards on the table here and say I don't myself come from an academic background, but I have seen in action the different types of knowledge that people from libraries and the collection sector more broadly bring to the table. And what we would like to see at the AHRC is a greater recognition of that, to make that mainstream, really, because not just in, I mean, all too often, if you have a sort of life cycle of a research project, you know, the librarian or the sort of informatics person is brought in at the last minute to solve a question or solve a problem, a small technical problem. What we'd like to see is for them to be brought in right from the outset to help formulate the questions. And I think there is the capacity and the expertise to do that. Obviously, there will need to be support.
Good, thank you for that. Now, that's the first of our 2 surveys, which was to get a stronger feel for the audience. we now have a question and answer session proper, as it were. I mean, I think we've actually begun to start the question and answer session anyway, so they're merging into one. But this is an opportunity for you to ask questions directly of the panel, preferably using the Zoom Q&A facility. So it's myself, it's Jane, it's Matt, and it's Tao. So over to you, the participants in the webinar.
David, before we pick up in the Q&A, there's one really interesting discussion that's just about to disappear off the chat for me, which was around the impetus for these research projects and where it's coming from. And there was an interesting query about question 5 as to how, as a librarian, you could answer whether you were going to be involved in a project with a library lead, which assumed that the lead would be an academic researcher, I think, whereas the question obviously can come from both sides. So I think people's experience of where the impetus for those projects is coming from would be a really interesting thing to pick up in some of the research for the project.
Yes, indeed. Yes, point well made and well taken.
I would add that, you know, there are institutional barriers, I think, or there are perceived barriers on the part of the AHRC that somehow or other, unless you hold an academic post, you are not eligible for UKRI funding. That's not the case. You are eligible to be a principal investigator and a co-investigator. And so you are eligible as an expert in your field to instigate and lead a research project. As far as UKRI and AHRC is concerned, there is no barrier.
Again, it's very early days, but I think some people do perceive it to be, certainly from the people who've responded to date. So, but again, important point to take further. Barriers seem to me to tend to come out of academic administration rather than academics. Point noted, and again, that is a theme that's also emerging. Any particular questions at this stage from the audience in terms of the panel? If there aren't, what I propose to do, given the time, is that we will go on to the second round of questions, which I suspect will also stimulate more questioning anyway. So could we then go to question 7? And I think this is likely to stimulate debate and question. So question 7, what is the greatest barrier to greater active academic and research library involvement in research? We've got a pretty extensive round of answers already, but I'm going to give just a few seconds for anybody who hasn't answered to add in. I'm not entirely surprised that capacity or time issues is top. I'd be surprised if it weren't, to be honest. But panel members or indeed audience, any particular reactions to that series of bars? I suppose the other one that we've just been talking about, of course, is attitudes to library involvement in research within the HE sector. Yeah, the other point just come lack of awareness of what libraries can contribute. Any particular comment about that list?
I think taken together, the first two, the attitudes to library involvement and institutional reward and recognition structures, because those are quite intertwined. That's a significant number of people who are facing those sorts of hurdles of even getting started in trying to, if you're getting knocked back the first time you suggest getting involved with a research project, then it becomes very, very difficult. And
I think they chime also with some of the institutional barriers. I think Masood and Mark have just mentioned that in the chat. Some of those institutional barriers within institutions and some of the challenges around that as well chime with those first two in particular.
And that's a very hard thing to deal with because it's not the same at all institutions. Some institutions handle these things very well and others much less so. And
some of that combination between quite tangible challenges and issues that can be overcome and cultural differences as well, I think is coming out through the chat in relation to institutional barriers.
I do also sympathise, not least personally, about the librarian as PI is not seen as usual, requires a lot of explanation and faff. I bear the scars myself on that one, yeah. Okay, anything more on question 7? Yeah, ref structures, agreed. Could I suggest we move on to question 8 then? not least given the time. Now, this is one where you'll see the answers. It's a kind of free vote, as I call it. So I'm going to ask colleagues on the panel to comment as the responses are scrolled up, and indeed colleagues participating in the webinar. Yeah.
I think we've touched on this a few times in comments and discussions about networking, about knowledge of opportunities, and that's I think matchmaking is probably too crude a term, but that's cross-fertilization between communities and these wider conversations we're having today on a larger scale.
I very much take Guy Baxter's point to heart about the day job, as it were. You know, that doing this kind of research work is not seen as part of the day job. But I also saw an earlier comment about cultures can change, redefining librarians' roles. Yeah, research councils to fund library contributions. Tao, any thought on that one?
What sort of contributions do people have in mind? Contributions to time?
Well, it says contributions to fund library contributions. I'm not quite sure what the person had in mind. But I assume it's contributions in terms of skills as much as collections, for example.
I think, I mean, what I was going to ask in terms of my response to this was what sort of change in terms of policy would people like to see from AHRC or from UKRI more broadly? You know, there are measures or mechanisms that we can put in place to enable or mandate grant holders and those who are eligible, you know, organizations that we fund to include or take a more collaborative approach. Is this something that would be welcome? Should we run a series of special calls, targeted calls? I'd just be interested to hear.
And Tao, there's been a lot of love for the Collaborative Doctoral Awards scheme in the chat, and it was also mentioned in question 8 by somebody. And the idea that where do you go after that collaborative PhD, and are there more opportunities that could build on that kind of profile for where that collaboration is built into at the heart of the research project at postdoctoral level as well?
I think that's one of the big gaps in AHRC provision. I mean, there are lots of gaps, I have to say, but one of them is that there is no career path. There's no clearly defined career path for those who have come out of a collaborative doctoral, whether it's a collaborative doctoral partnership or other kind of collaborative doctoral award. When they were first sort of conceived and came online, the idea was to have individuals who could navigate both sectors and multiple worlds with equal ease, as it were. But we have found that sometimes it can be difficult. They either then have to go back into academia or they go back into a sort of academic service environment. And there's no in-between space to recognize the breadth of the skills that they bring to the table. So yes, that is an area that needs to be addressed.
There's one question that it may seem an obvious one, but I assume there's a fairly straightforward answer. Is it possible to work on a collaborative project with multiple academic and research libraries? The answer must surely be a yes. No issue. Are there any particular issues there?
No, none at all.
No, I thought so.
Just before we move on, David, could you just say, like, the volume of chat and Q&A is incredible. We will be taking all the answers from the Mentimeter and the questions and the chat, and we'll be featuring that in some of on David's blog and on the website afterwards. So even though we may not be answering your question or chat, it is logged. So fear not.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say that, sorry, you go first. Was it you, Jane, wanted to come in?
It was just me sort of saying, I've just seen a comment in the responses saying remove barriers for librarians to become PIs. I think this is something that it comes up again and again. As far as UKRI or AHRC is concerned, there are no barriers. There is nothing to stop someone in a university library or an individual in a university museum or who looks after a collection from initiating and leading a research project. But I do understand that within the organizations, there may be barriers. So I would be interested in having, fielding ideas about what you'd like to see from us as a funder to try to remove those barriers, to raise awareness that there are no barriers on our side.
Tao, there's a really interesting point from John Hodgson in the chat that I recognised from putting research applications together as well, is the kind of off-putting requirement to have a publications list, which sort of puts somebody in a particular mould to start off with and assumes that that is the key focus of your work. And the scholarly and research outputs that come from the library sector often look very different. So I wonder if there might be some way of acknowledging that in how people demonstrate their expertise.
Absolutely. We are in the process of enlarging or expanding the peer review college to include people who do not come from a straightforward standard academic background, as it were. There are professional journals, publications, conferences, and outputs which are recognized by your communities, which are seen as being at the forefront of practice and knowledge. Research community hasn't quite caught up yet, but we'd like to. It's the point of this exercise.
Some interesting comments coming through also about RL UK running workshops. I mean, I guess that's a fairly obvious thing to look further into in terms of our research, evidence-based research. I think there's also a kind of thread coming through, as far as I can see, at organisation, at institutional level, about hierarchies that clearly needs to be tackled at institutional as well as above institutional level. We've got a few moments left. Any more comments from the panel, or any further comments in chat, or indeed any questions for the panel before we begin to round up our town hall meeting?
I don't know if we covered this question in the Q&A of how librarians can overcome the lack of knowledge of what we bring to the table, especially with websites and event talent marketing already very prominent. And I think that's how can you put the information where people are going to be looking for it, which is really difficult when everyone's got different focuses.
I mean, one thing AHRC could do is to run calls to which only sort of librarians and archivists are eligible to apply, or where the PI has to be a librarian, somebody who works in that sector, and academic post holders can only be co-Is at most. I mean, that's one thing to bring it to greater prominence, as it were. But
we've got a couple more questions in the Mentimeter. So shall we move on to we've got what's the characteristics of good research collaboration? Anything in there that we haven't already covered?
I think time is a really interesting one. It does take a long time to get these partnerships off the ground and to build the trust and collaboration and equality that other people are mentioning. And that is something that, that was clear from one of the earlier questions, that people don't have a lot of. So
really interesting question coming in about, does AHRC know how many library professionals serve on peer review panels? I presume the answer is not that many.
It's not that many. It's far too few.
Yeah. I think that's again another one too. And then,
but I would say that if where we do run calls, and we've run some calls recently, which I suppose would be considered to be non-standard calls around infrastructure, kit, fitting out of facilities and things like that, where we've specifically said that the PI needs to be somebody who is used to managing and delivering major infrastructural projects. And therefore, where there have been PIs who are academics, we've raised a question mark over it, but we've brought in a panel which is not predominantly not from the peer review college, but from the sector.
Yeah. There was a comment earlier about the tension between institutional and above institutional in terms of, you know, the institution is the one that pays you, as it were, as a librarian, and the extent to which work that a librarian is doing in terms of a research project is benefiting the institution as opposed to other institutions. I get that's something we need to have a look at. Any more on, do we have another question? Remind me.
Yes, we do.
What, that's it. Okay, so what are the characteristics of a bad research collaboration between libraries and researchers? We've only got 68 responses so far, so if we can get that up, I'll give you a minute or so, and then we've got a final 5 minutes for question and answer if there's anything else. And just to round up before we close our town hall meeting at 3 o'clock. Territoriality, yes, that's I agree with that one. Too much focus on metrics rather than the real purpose behind a project. A lot of cultural points, I guess. Jane?
And there's quite a lot about using the library for technical support. Sometimes that happens after the project's been successful rather than before. And that not having a full engagement, and someone's mentioned co-design from the beginning, that it's not an equal relationship there often. Yeah, indeed. Are research projects which have an international dimension considered? The answer is presumably yes, within certain constraints. Is it in terms of AHRC funding?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We've got 4.5 minutes by my clock. Any final comments on the survey questions, or any questions or comments through the chat or the Q&A facility that colleagues on the panel would like to respond to before we wind up? There are 2 or 3 things I want to say by way of closing.
Just want to quickly flag, in looking at the wealth of the comments and the questions coming in, that this is a really important conversation for us to be having, and we want it to continue beyond today's town hall. I know that David will mention this in his wrap up, but the project website, we'll put a link in the chat. Please do contribute, because we want to keep this conversation going and feed it right into the research.
Can I just pick something up about something I saw in the questions, which I thought I was answering, and then I couldn't type in the box. So to the person who asked me whether we need, whether we can expand the engagement beyond libraries, this particular commission is focused on the role of people, mostly on academic and research libraries. There are, and there will be, other similar types of exercise around collections more broadly, but it's a huge sector. It's museums, libraries, archives, smaller collections. We didn't think that within the time frame that was available to us, we could do justice to the entire sort of collections sectors. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for that. Jane, any final words from you before I wrap up?
No, just to say that this has been fantastic, and the comments and questions and the Mentimeter results, there's so much in there, and I'm sure that's going to be incredibly helpful for taking this discussion further.